You open your phone for one reason, just to check something quick, a message, maybe, or the time, and 40 minutes later you are still there, scrolling through something you didn't choose to watch, laughing at something you'll forget by tomorrow, feeling vaguely worse than when you started but unable to say exactly why. This happens to almost everyone now, quietly, repeatedly, without ceremony. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from this. Not physical exhaustion, not the kind you get from labor or exercise. Something else. A mental residue that builds up across the day, mostly invisible, mostly unspoken. You finish scrolling and you feel like you've done something, even though nothing actually happened. No conversation, no memory worth keeping, just motion, endless motion. Maybe you've noticed it too. That strange flatness after closing an app, like waking up from a nap that didn't rest you. What's actually happening is simpler than it feels, and somehow more unsettling once you see it clearly. Your attention has become a product, not metaphorically, literally. It is harvested, measured, packaged, and sold, often before you've finished your morning coffee. This isn't a conspiracy theory or some dramatic claim about hidden agendas. It's just the business model. The apps you use every day were not built to inform you, or connect you, or even entertain you, not primarily. They were built to hold your eyes in place for as long as biologically possible, because every additional second translates into something valuable for someone else. You are not the customer, you are the inventory. That sentence sounds harsh when you first hear it, almost insulting, but sit with it for a moment, and it starts explaining things that used to feel confusing. Why does the scroll never quite end? Why does one video lead so smoothly into another, with no natural stopping point, no credits rolling, no sense of closure? Why does checking a single notification so often turn into 20 minutes you can't really account for? It's not an accident. It was never supposed to feel like an accident. There's a particular discomfort in realizing that something designed to feel effortless was actually engineered with extraordinary precision. Teams of people, genuinely brilliant people, spent years studying how human attention works. What colors hold focus longer? What intervals between rewards keep curiosity alive the longest? What kind of uncertainty makes a person check again and again and again? And maybe that's the strange part. None of this required malice. It just required optimization. Somewhere in a meeting room, someone asked a perfectly reasonable business question. How do we increase engagement? And every answer to that question, refined over more than a decade, eventually arrived at the same destination. Make the experience just uncertain enough to feel irresistible, just unpredictable enough to feel alive. This is the same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines compelling. Not certainty, but the possibility of something good happening at any moment. Your brain doesn't crave the reward itself nearly as much as it craves the anticipation of the reward, the not knowing, the maybe this time, which explains something people rarely say out loud. The thumb keeps moving even after the content stops being interesting. You've probably felt this without naming it. A video that wasn't even that funny, but you watched the next one anyway. Not because you wanted to, because something in the rhythm of it carried you forward before you decided anything at all. There's an odd kind of guilt that follows this. People often blame themselves for these moments, calling it laziness, or weak willpower, or personal failure to focus. But that framing misses what's actually happening. You're not weak. You're responding exactly the way a healthy human brain is supposed to respond to a system explicitly built to exploit that response. It's not a character flaw. It's an engineering success, just not your own. And maybe that reframing matters more than it seems. Because once you understand the mechanism, the shame starts to fade a little. You stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what's actually happening here. What's actually happening is an economy, a very real one, even if it never shows up as a transaction you can see. Every minute you spend scrolling generates data. What you paused on, what made you stop breathing for half a second, what made you angry enough to comment, what made you nostalgic enough to share. All of this becomes a profile, refined endlessly, sold quietly to advertisers who are not interested in you as a person, only in you as a predictable pattern. This is the part that feels strange to say out loud, but it's worth saying anyway. You are simultaneously the product, the consumer, and the raw material. There's a particular late evening scene that captures this well, the kind almost everyone has lived through. Lying in bed, phone glowing in the dark, scrolling through other people's vacations, other people's apparent happiness, other people's certainty. And somewhere in that scroll, a small ache starts to form. Not jealousy exactly, something quieter. A sense of falling slightly behind in a race you never agreed to enter. That ache isn't incidental to the platform. It's part of what keeps people opening it again tomorrow. Comparison has always existed, of course. Humans have always measured themselves against neighbors, classmates, siblings. But the scale of comparison used to be limited by geography, by how many people you actually knew. Now the comparison pool is, for practical purposes, infinite. You're not just comparing yourself to your street anymore. You're comparing yourself to the most curated, filtered, algorithmically amplified version of 7 billion lives. No wonder it feels exhausting. The wonder would be if it didn't. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from constant comparison, and it rarely announces itself directly. It doesn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It builds slowly, almost like sediment, settling at the bottom of an ordinary day until one evening you realize you feel quietly inadequate without being able to point to any specific reason why. Maybe that's the part nobody warns you about. The exhaustion doesn't come from one bad scroll. It comes from thousands of small ones, stacked invisibly over months. And somewhere inside that stacking, identity starts shifting too. Not dramatically, just gradually. People begin curating their own lives the same way they consume everyone else's, choosing angles, captions, timing, filters, not necessarily out of vanity, but out of a quiet, almost defensive instinct to keep up with a standard that was never natural to begin with. This is where attention stops being just a resource and starts becoming a performance. You post not entirely for yourself anymore, but for an imagined audience whose approval somehow matters more than it should. A meal becomes a photo before it becomes a memory. A sunset becomes content before it becomes an experience. And the strange part is how unconscious this shift feels while it's happening. Nobody decides one day to start performing their life. It just slowly becomes the default setting. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If so much of daily experience is filtered through how it will be perceived, how much of it is actually being lived? That question tends to make people uncomfortable, and reasonably so. Nobody wants to feel like their own life has become a marketing exercise. But there's no use pretending the platforms aren't built precisely to encourage this blending of self and spectacle, because validation, in the form of likes, views, and comments, is one of the most reliable engagement mechanisms ever discovered. Every notification carries a tiny dose of social affirmation, a small chemical nudge that says someone noticed you, someone approved, and the brain, being the brain, wants more of that feeling almost immediately. This is where things get financially interesting, because attention doesn't just get sold to advertisers in some abstract sense. It gets converted into spending behavior with remarkable efficiency. Think about how often a purchase begins not from need, but from a feeling. Boredom, loneliness, a bad day at work, the dull ache of comparing your apartment to someone else's perfectly staged living room. In these moments, the phone becomes more than entertainment. It becomes a small emotional escape hatch, and shopping apps know this better than almost anyone. A single tap leads to a product page. A product page leads to a countdown timer suggesting urgency, a limited stock warning, a flash sale ending in 11 minutes. None of this is coincidental. It's psychological pressure, dressed up as convenience, and the purchase itself rarely solves the original feeling. It just interrupts it, briefly, with a small dopamine spike that fades faster than the credit card statement does. This is the quiet architecture of modern emotional spending, not reckless greed, not financial irresponsibility in the way older generations might describe it, but something more subtle. A kind of self-soothing that happens to take place inside an economy specifically engineered to encourage it. People rarely think of a late-night online purchase as a coping mechanism, but that's often exactly what it is. If these conversations help you slow down and think a little differently about modern life, you're welcome to stay around for the rest of this one. There's a particular kind of quiet panic that surfaces around payday, especially for people earning what should reasonably be considered a decent income. Money arrives, and within days, sometimes hours, it seems to dissolve into subscriptions, deliveries, small impulsive purchases that felt entirely justified in the moment and strangely unnecessary in hindsight. Nobody plans to feel this way. It happens gradually, the same way the comparison fatigue does. One subscription here for convenience, one there for entertainment, a cloud storage plan, a streaming service, a fitness app, a meditation app, ironically, meant to help with the very stress these systems quietly contribute to. Each subscription costs very little individually. Together, they form a slow financial leak that most people never fully calculate. This is lifestyle inflation in its modern form, not necessarily bigger houses or luxury cars, but 1,000 small digital commitments that accumulate beneath conscious awareness. And the strange thing is how normal this has become, almost expected, almost invisible. People don't talk about subscription fatigue at dinner parties the way they might talk about a big financial decision. Yet collectively, this fragmented spending often adds up to more than any single luxury purchase would. Maybe that's part of what makes modern financial pressure feel so confusing. It rarely arrives as one obvious mistake. It arrives as hundreds of small, reasonable-seeming choices that compound quietly in the background. At the same time, there's a separate kind of pressure building from the comparison itself. Watching other people travel, renovate, upgrade, celebrate milestones that feel increasingly out of reach. Real estate listings that once seemed aspirational now feel almost theoretical, a kind of distant fantasy rather than a realistic life plan. And somewhere in that quiet gap between expectation and reality, financial shame starts to grow. Financial shame doesn't always look like financial struggle. Sometimes it looks like someone with a steady job, a reasonable salary, who still feels like they're falling behind because the comparison isn't local anymore. It's global, curated, and relentless. People rarely admit this discomfort directly. It tends to surface sideways, through irritability, through avoidance, through that specific kind of silence that follows opening a banking app late at night and immediately closing it again without really looking. There's a particular sound that exists only in moments like that. The faint click of a phone screen turning off after someone glances at their balance and decides, almost instinctively, not to think about it any further tonight. Not denial exactly, more like a quiet form of self-preservation, a way of postponing a feeling that seems too heavy to process at 11 at night, alone, after a long day that already took more than it gave. This avoidance isn't laziness either, it's protective. The mind does this on purpose, shielding itself from a stress it doesn't yet have the energy to face directly. But the avoidance has a cost too, because the discomfort doesn't disappear just because it's been postponed. It just moves somewhere quieter, settling into the background of everyday thought, occasionally surfacing as restlessness, irritability, or that strange tightness in the chest that some people only notice when they finally sit still. And maybe that's worth pausing on for a second. How much of modern exhaustion isn't really about working too hard, but about constantly managing feelings that never get a proper moment to be felt? There's a kind of numbness that builds from this pattern too. Not sadness exactly, not anxiety in the clinical sense, but a dull emotional flatness that comes from being stimulated constantly without ever being nourished. Endless content, endless comparison, endless tiny purchases meant to patch a feeling rather than resolve it. After a while, the nervous system adapts the only way it knows how. It goes quiet. People sometimes describe this as burnout, though it rarely matches the dramatic image that word usually conjures. It isn't always collapse. Sometimes it's just a persistent, low-grade tiredness that follows you through ordinary tasks, making everything feel slightly heavier than it should. You make dinner and it feels like an obligation rather than a comfort. You watch something you used to enjoy and notice you're not really watching it, just letting it play while your mind drifts somewhere else entirely. You scroll through old photos looking for some version of yourself that felt more present, more interested, more alive. This isn't really about technology being evil, because that framing oversimplifies something far more complicated. Technology, on its own, is neutral. The phone in your pocket isn't conspiring against you personally, but the systems built around that phone were absolutely designed with specific outcomes in mind. And those outcomes were never really about your well-being. They were about engagement metrics, time on platform, click-through rates, conversion percentages, numbers that translate directly into advertising revenue, regardless of how those numbers affect the humans generating them. This is the part that feels uncomfortable to say plainly, but probably needs to be said anyway. Your distraction is profitable. Your insecurity is profitable. Your loneliness, in a strange and almost clinical way, is profitable too. Because lonely people tend to spend more time seeking connection through screens, which means more exposure to advertising, more opportunities for emotional purchases, more data generated about what soothes you, even temporarily. None of this requires a villain twirling a mustache somewhere in a boardroom. It just requires a system that rewards attention capture above almost everything else, refined over years by thousands of well-intentioned people optimizing one small metric at a time, rarely stepping back to consider the cumulative human cost of all those small optimizations combined. Which is, in a way, a strange kind of tragedy, not driven by cruelty, but by an almost mechanical drift toward whatever keeps people looking longer. There's a moment that happens sometimes, usually late at night, where a person puts the phone down, not because they finished what they were doing, but because some quiet internal alarm finally went off. A faint awareness that something doesn't feel right, that the last hour disappeared without leaving anything behind. No memory, no meaning, just a vague sense of having been somewhere without actually going anywhere. That moment of noticing matters more than it seems, because awareness, even partial awareness, starts to interrupt the automatic nature of the pattern. Once you see the mechanism clearly, once you understand that the endless scroll wasn't designed for your benefit, something subtle changes. Not everything, not immediately, but something. Maybe it starts with noticing the specific feeling right before you open an app. Not what you're looking for, but what you're avoiding. Boredom, tension, loneliness. A difficult emotion sitting just beneath the surface, waiting for distraction to smooth it over before it can be fully felt. That tiny pause, the 1 second before the thumb moves automatically toward the screen, is probably one of the most powerful moments available in modern life. Not because it solves everything, it doesn't, but because it reintroduces choice into something that had quietly become reflex. This is harder than it sounds, of course. The systems weren't built to make that pause easy. Every design choice, every notification, every infinite scroll mechanism exists specifically to prevent that exact moment of hesitation from happening. Friction is the enemy of engagement, and these platforms have spent enormous resources removing friction from your experience, one click at a time. So noticing the pull and choosing to pause anyway is a small act of resistance against something engineered with extraordinary precision to override exactly that kind of resistance. It won't feel dramatic, it rarely does. Most meaningful psychological shifts happen quietly, without applause, without anyone else noticing. You just close the app one evening instead of opening another one. You sit with the discomfort for a few minutes instead of immediately soothing it. And nothing explodes, nothing transforms overnight, but something small loosens, just slightly, somewhere underneath the noise. There's something worth noticing in that small loosening, even if it feels almost too quiet to matter at first. Most of what keeps people trapped in these patterns isn't a lack of intelligence or willpower. It's simply that the patterns were never visible to begin with. You can't resist a mechanism you don't know exists. Once you see it, even partially, the relationship changes, even if the behavior takes longer to follow. Maybe that's the strangest part of all this. The goal was never to make people feel powerless. The goal was simply engagement, optimized relentlessly, without much thought for what that optimization would eventually cost emotionally, financially, or psychologically. And the cost turned out to be larger than almost anyone anticipated when these systems were first built. It shows up in scattered attention that makes deep focus feel almost foreign now, in financial habits shaped more by emotional impulse than by intention, in identities subtly reshaped around how experiences will be perceived rather than how they're actually lived, and in a quiet undercurrent of comparison that never fully turns off, even during moments that should otherwise feel peaceful. None of this means people are broken. It means people are responding, in entirely understandable ways, to an environment built with extraordinary skill to produce exactly these responses. There's a kind of relief in that reframing, even if it doesn't immediately fix anything. Because so much modern self-blame comes from people believing they personally lack discipline, lack focus, lack the ability to simply stop scrolling, stop comparing, stop spending impulsively. But discipline was never really the missing ingredient. Awareness was. And awareness, once it arrives, tends to spread quietly into small daily choices. Maybe it means noticing the specific feeling that sends you reaching for your phone instead of immediately acting on it. Maybe it means recognizing a purchase as emotional rather than necessary, not to feel guilty about it, but simply to understand it more honestly. Maybe it means realizing that comparison fatigue isn't a personal weakness, but a predictable response to an environment engineered around comparison as a core mechanism. None of these realizations require dramatic life changes. They don't ask you to delete every app, abandon every platform, or retreat into some idealized version of simplicity that probably never existed the way nostalgia imagines it. That kind of all or nothing thinking rarely lasts anyway, and it usually isn't necessary. What seems to matter more is something quieter, a returning sense of agency, the simple, almost radical idea that you get to notice what's happening to your attention, your emotions, your spending, your sense of self, and respond a little more intentionally, even within a system that wasn't built with your intention in mind. This won't undo years of conditioning overnight. Nobody should expect that. But small moments of awareness tend to compound, quietly, the same way subscription costs compound, except in the opposite direction. A little more presence here, a little less automatic reaching there, a little more honesty about what a purchase or a scroll session is actually trying to soothe. Over time, these moments add up to something that starts to feel almost unexpectedly like relief. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from finally understanding why something felt so exhausting for so long, even when life looked fine on the surface. Not because the explanation fixes everything immediately, but because it removes the added weight of believing the exhaustion was somehow your fault all along. It wasn't a personal failure. It was a predictable human response to one of the most sophisticated attention systems ever built, refined continuously, almost invisibly, by people who were simply doing their jobs extremely well. Maybe that knowledge alone won't change much tonight, but it might change something tomorrow, the next time a notification lights up the room in some quiet, internal voice finally asks whether this moment is something you actually want, or something you've simply been trained to reach for. That question, asked often enough, gently enough, without judgment, tends to shift things slowly. Not perfectly, not permanently, just enough to feel, occasionally, like you're living your own life again, instead of simply feeding someone else's metrics. There's something comforting about finally noticing the pressure instead of constantly running from it. About recognizing the architecture behind the exhaustion instead of absorbing it as a personal flaw. About understanding that your attention has value, real, measurable, financial value, and that knowing this changes how freely you decide to give it away. Maybe modern life feels a little lighter once we stop pretending we're unaffected by all of this. Once we admit, quietly, to ourselves, that the tiredness was real, that the comparison was real, that the spending patterns made a strange kind of emotional sense even when they didn't make financial sense. And maybe that's enough for tonight. Not a solution, not a transformation, just a little more clarity than you had this morning. And perhaps, the next time your thumb moves toward the screen without thinking, a half second of hesitation that wasn't there before. That half second belongs to you.